Quick public service announcement. We at Barbell Medicine are running our red, white, and blue sale for America's 250th, and I'm required by law to inform you that your path to freedom and independence starts by choosing strength and wellness. Look, that's just the official copy. I'm just here for the 30% off, so let that eagle soar, brother. Here's the deal. Apparel and accessories are 30% off. That's hats, t-shirts, everything we have in stock. It's closeout pricing on the whole selection, so grab your gear before it's gone. Consultations are also 20% off. That's real one-on-one time with our coaches and our physicians. That's myself, Dr. Baraki, and the other Dr. Baraki. We're here to answer your questions and point you in the right direction. Programs are 20% off too. Now, we just released our new second generation Hypertrophy 2 template, but all of our other templates are on sale. 20% off pre-built templates for whatever you're training for. And we also take FSA and HSA. So head to the website and see how your pre-tax dollars can pitch in. The deal ends July 6th at midnight. The discounts are automatic, so you don't need a code at checkout, but you can't combine it with any other offers, and some exclusions may apply. Head over to barbellmedicine.com and go be free. This is the Barbell Medicine direct line, our monthly Ask Us Anything. Now, normally the whole episode is behind a paywall for our Barbell Medicine Plus subscribers, but this month we pulled 4 questions out of it to give you a free run at it. Yeah, we're talking about GLP-1 drugs again and what effects they have on muscle mass, but this time we got a different bend on it, whether creatine helps or not. Then we talk about whether bulking and cutting does anything compared to main gaining, how to train on 1 hour a week, and how fast you actually lose your gains when you stop training. The full 2 hours in every back episode live on Barbell Medicine Plus, which is now bundled with Barbell Medicine Premium. More on that at the end. Let's get into the episode. All right, next question is about creatine on GLP-1s. So the question is, resistance training on GLP-1s, creatine, yay or nay, has it been studied? So I think why this all matters, it goes back to this muscle mass loss concern and perhaps even more specifically, a decrease in muscle function as a result of that muscle loss from GLP-1s. We have talked about this at length before, but just to recapitulate, we need to reframe how we're measuring muscle loss because, again, people put DEXA, this X-ray technology, on a pedestal like, oh, it's super accurate. There are no errors here, but that is definitively not the case. DEXA splits up the human body compartments into bone, fat, and everything else. And that everything else, the sort of third bin, gets called lean mass, but it's also water, glycogen, organ tissue, and specifically intramuscular and intraliver fat, okay? So when weight loss occurs, all of that goes down. Glycogen goes down, liver fat goes down, specifically with GLP-1s. Inflammation tends to go down. Intramuscular fat goes down. But all of that is read as lean mass loss by DEXA because it cannot differentiate between those compartments. Sure, it does pick up actual loss of adipose tissue that's stored in body fat, but the fat that's stored in your liver and the liver mass itself and the fat that's stored in your muscle also goes down. And DEXA just reads that as lean mass. So if you were to think about a sort of prediction, how much lean mass would you predict to actually be lost from GLP-1s? It would be the same as like a diet-only intervention, which would be about 1/4 of all the weight being lost would be muscle mass. That is the sort of prevailing sort of line in the sand that's been drawn for years and years and years. And so things you can do to modify that include resistance training, changing the dietary intervention, adjusting the rate of loss, and a better instrumentation to capture what's actually being lost. All right, so we're going to go through that. With respect to training, the studies to date on GLP-1s and resistance training are relatively small. There was the liraglutide trial.
The S-Lite is the trial name.
Yeah,
S-Lite,
yeah. Yeah, the S-Lite trial showed that with resistance training, you lose about half as much lean body mass. Also, those people got stronger. There's the T-Rex study, which we have some preliminary results from. Great name, by the way. But the resistance training arm roughly halved the amount of lean mass that's being lost versus the GLP-1 alone. And this is the same relationship that you see with diet interventions versus diet plus exercise. So if the sort of prediction was that you're going to lose about 25% for all the weight that you lose, about 25% of it is lean mass, right? Accepting that it's not just contractile muscle tissue, it's this other stuff too. With resistance training, we think you're going to cut that in half. That is our prediction. It's not been studied adequately with GLP-1s, but there's this that is the state of the evidence. My hot take get your take on this, Dr. Baraki. I actually predict that GLP-1s, whether they're combined with resistance training or not, may actually have a more favorable muscle preservation effect, meaning that people don't lose as much, quote, actual muscle tissue when they just do the GLP-1 alone, or when they do GLP-1 plus resistance training compared to diet alone versus diet and exercise alone. Why would I say that? I think these GLP-1s are just much better at reducing what we would call ectopic fat storage. Ectopic just means, look, your fat's in a place where it shouldn't be, in the liver, in the muscle mass, and then visceral adipose tissue, that fat around your the organs, your internal organs. It just seems to be better than diet alone. So I actually think like maybe it would be even more favorable. I don't know. How does that strike you?
It is indeed a hot take, and I'm going to be reluctant to sign on to hot takes that involve what I'll call like a positive claim, and I will stick with the null hypothesis for now until I have reason to move my opinion elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence here that particularly like tirzepatide, which is the dual agonist, GIP and GLP-1,
yep.
And then specifically the newer agents that are triple agonists or more, that involve a glucagon receptor agonist like retatrutide, survodutide. There's a few other ones. The glucagon receptor agonists seem to like really get rid of liver fat, and the liver mass goes down.
This is true.
Meaning that a bigger proportion of the lean mass loss is from the liver. So again, if you compared somebody who lost 20 pounds with diet alone versus they lost 20 pounds with one of these, either tirzepatide, retatrutide, when it's approved, survodutide, whatever, I actually think that they've lost more non-contractile tissue because it's so damn good at getting rid of liver fat, visceral adipose tissue, and intramuscular fat. That's my hot take. And there's some evidence there.
Lilly has an opportunity here because they certainly have the cash at this point with how successful they've been to date to not use DEXA scans for their studies and instead just do MRIs in people. And then that would answer the question. And if they were able to show something like that, then boom, like that's the biggest, flex that they would have. It's not only do we have the most effective drug, but by MRI proven like the least muscle mass loss or something like that. And then they're going to start combining, with some of the myostatin inhibitors potentially and show some effects from there. There's going to be even more efficacy, I think, once we start combining with like eloralintide. So that's one that I'm like very optimistic about as it's an amylin receptor agonist that when combined with tirzepatide actually, so like you'll have patients who are plateaued on 15 milligrams of tirzepatide and then you add the eloralintide, which is an amylin agonist, and they start losing weight more beyond that without substantial side effects. And so the future is bright for this field. And then if they could just put these concerns to bed about like loss of muscle mass and things like that, particularly like unique loss of contractile tissue, muscle mass strength, things like that, by using better measurement tools than DEXA, then they would definitely have the strongest case in this space.
Yeah, I feel very confident, supremely confident, in fact, that adding resistance training to a GLP-1 for an individual is going to be beneficial for preserving muscle mass. You're probably going to cut at least half of the actual contractile muscle tissue loss. That's our prediction. I feel less confident, but optimistic that the actual amount of loss from GLP-1s is perhaps a little bit better than diet alone. And in the same vein, I don't think that the muscle losses are excessive, at least by available data. If there was all this sarcopenia signal, for example, I would feel differently. But to date, that's not the case. So ultimately, resistance training has been understudied in this population, but I think we have no reason to expect that it would be like bad. But I don't think that's what she's asking. It's more just like, look, what is the actual evidence on this? It's a little skinny at this point. The second part of this question was, what about creatine? This has not been studied in GLP-1s, period. So to the extent that somebody says, look, this is evidence-based for reducing the muscle loss from GLP-1s. Well, one, the muscle loss really wasn't that crazy to begin with, thing one. Thing two, it's never been studied in GLP-1s. And then the third thing is when it's been studied outside of GLP-1s, it has a very modest effect and even more modest to arguably small, perhaps negligible on actual muscle mass. The effects on muscle mass and strength to some degree are mostly related to, again, training load. We go back to sort of maximizing training load. And so generally speaking, people on creatine can do a few more reps, lift a little bit more weight, training load goes up a little bit. Strength performance does have some sort of direct effect from creatine based on energy because the actual, in many individuals, now they have more intracellular energy to commit to heavy efforts. But for hypertrophy, really, it's mostly through training load, and it's a pretty small effect. Still, nothing in GLP-1s, but if somebody on a GLP-1 was interested in using creatine, fine.
Yeah, I actually did a little searching and I found that there is a kind of pre-registered pilot trial on clinicaltrials.gov. This is from the University of Saskatchewan. I'd be interested to see. Yep, shout out. I have some background, family background up in that part of the world. And so it looks like they are doing a randomized trial of 40 people starting GLP-1 agonists to receive either 10 grams per day of creatine, solid dose, or placebo during a resistance training program, which will be 3 days per week for 12 weeks. And so they said it is hypothesized that participants on creatine will have superior maintenance of lean tissue mass. We'll see again how they choose to measure that, and function performance compared to participants taking placebo. Now, this is going to be a tough one, I think, because again, to your point, the effect of creatine in general tends to be relatively modest, and you have two groups that are both training. And so it's like you need an effect that outweighs the effect of training itself to a big enough degree that you're going to be able to detect that difference in a sample of 40 people over 12 weeks. So I question the power of this trial. It's going to depend on, how they're training these people, and then also how they're measuring the outcomes. But it looks like the study start date was May 25th of 2026. So like 3 weeks ago, and its completion, I don't know why it says primary completion estimated is going to be in December of 2027. So that's that's the pace that research goes at. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to the results of that one.
Yeah, watch this space.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the story on GLP-1, the resistance training evidence to date, creatine. All right, next question. We're going to talk about one of the most, longest lasting arguments in the fitness space. Bulking and cutting, should you do that, or should you just maintain weight? Main gaining, right? So the question is, does bulking and cutting actually do anything meaningful? If a guy goes from 180 to 200 pounds, back to 180 pounds while training, isn't he just back to 180 without any body composition change explained from the training itself? Feels like the industry oversells it. I mean, look, I'm inclined to agree. I'm not going to protect the fitness industry. Most of what's being said in the space is BS. So probably this included. But I think the main proposition here is as follows. You have to gain weight or bulk in order to increase muscle mass, and you're going to accept some degree of fat gain. That is true. The proportion determinants, so how much fat to muscle mass, are training, right? Genetics, drugs, and the rate of gain. The more training that you're doing, the more favorable your genetics, the more drugs that you use, and the more modest the rate of gain, the better proportion you're going to have, meaning more muscle mass versus fat mass, right? And then the opposite is also true. Then after doing the bulk and gaining the weight, in order to be leaner, you need to lose the body fat. You're also going to accept some degree of muscle loss, which is also true. And the thing that determines the proportions here, again, relative fat relative to muscle mass, are the same things: training, genetics, drugs, and rate of loss. With more training, more favorable genetics, more drugs, and a more modest rate of loss, we would predict more fat to be lost relative to muscle mass. And with less training, less favorable genetics, less drugs, and a faster rate of loss, the opposite: more muscle loss relative to fat mass. Now, I take that proposition and I compare it to the alternative. I'm just going to go maintenance. You would predict a slower amount of muscle gain, although it's hard to tell, particularly when you go slowly, because muscle gain itself is relatively slow, and there are problems with measuring this accurately. So like you may not know that you're not actually gaining any muscle if you're just using DEXA, for example. There's the error bars are there. It's pretty noisy, which is also totally fine, because like how fast do you need to go really, right? Is there like or is it a race, The other alternative would be like to try to train in a deficit where you can gain some muscle mass, but we would predict it to be even slower. Some of that's actually coming from like redistribution of muscles that you aren't necessarily using in training to muscles that you are. We saw that in a recent study. So for me, the decision here, should you do bulking versus main gaining versus trying to gain muscle mass in a deficit? It all comes down to first health, 2 constraints, and then 3, what are your preferences? Health-wise, if someone's got a BMI that is very consistent with carrying excess body fat, right, which would generally be above 30, certainly above 35. Alternatively, if their waist circumference was past the sort of known cut points, generally for men, it's at its most extreme end, 40 inches, less extreme, 37 inches for women, 31 and 29. Or if their waist to hip ratio is significantly above the target, which is 0.5, and or if they have a adiposity-based chronic disease, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, insulin resistance, whatever, all of the is a signal like you'd probably benefit from weight loss. Best case scenario. If you're not in a good place to do that, then maintaining your weight while also trying to improve body composition via exercise and lifestyle change would be great. Is this how you think about weight gain, weight management with respect to health? Like, I imagine most of your patients aren't coming in like, doc, I really just want to gain 20 pounds of muscle. Like, I feel like I need to do that. But theoretically, if you had that and you were trying to say, is this a good idea, bad idea? Does that framework from a health perspective make sense to you?
Yeah, I fully agree with that line of reasoning. The vast majority, obviously, with the type of work that I'm doing more these days in weight management involves conversations around weight loss and those types of goals, the types of health consequences we're trying to mitigate, making sure it's being done at like a relatively safe rate, that people aren't losing weight at an unsafe rate, things like that. But sometimes I've also seen patients who, maybe have taken things a bit too far and we need to slow things down, sometimes even deliberately gain some weight. And if anything, beside all the question of like what works best in this situation, for folks who have dealt with overweight and obesity in the past, having that conversation of like, we've actually gone too far and we need to actually deliberately gain some weight, it can be super challenging because they're like, I've lived with obesity my whole life, and it's really tough for me to like wrap my mind around the idea that I actually need to deliberately gain some weight. So those have been some of the more interesting and challenging conversations that I've had recently. Not being in the space where I'm like coaching bodybuilders, actually either these days or arguably ever, it means that I've fortunately been spared much of these conversations, but I wouldn't want to deliberately incur a lot of health consequences by way of weight gain and to say, oh, well, we're trying to gain some muscle mass. We're going to give you hypertension and insulin resistance, but don't worry. We'll just it'll be easy to lose the fat later, as has famously been said in the past. So that is not the approach that either of us would recommend for folks.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do think health, again, primarily should be the like major lever here, or major like determinant of which direction that you go. Mainly again to solve for training load, because if you are, your health is declining, that is going to compromise training load long term. The second is constraints. So if you think about a person who's like, look, my health is otherwise fine, and I agree with you, I'm going to monitor health. So what's, down this algorithm, what's the next sort of branch point? Well, is there a reason why you would specifically want to choose a faster either rate of gain or rate of loss? And depending on which direction you need to go, it may be with your competitive season. You're like, look, I can train hard during the off season. I got a lot of extra training resources because I don't have my competitive sport. Just have like some practice, some maintenance, sort of upkeep of skill set, and so on and so forth. Perhaps that is your branching point there, right? The other thing I would consider here, maybe the next branch point, is just preferences, right? A person with a history of obesity, I really get kind of weird about recommending a faster rate of gain. Generally speaking, you would predict that person is likely to gain more fat mass just in general compared to a person who's never had that issue. Whether or not that's a result of being obesity sensitive versus obesity resistant, probably playing a part there in addition to other factors. But the idea that it's easy to lose fat and to keep fat off, unfortunately, is not supported by evidence. If that were the case, then lifestyle interventions, intensive lifestyle interventions with nutritional counseling, exercise counseling, monitoring long-term would be far more successful. And unfortunately, that is not the case. So I think it is fine to accept fat gain when you are gaining muscle mass. But I think doing it rapidly and maybe even haphazardly with the idea like, I'll just lose it later, inconsistent with the current evidence, and I think ultimately would set people up for failure. So practically speaking, I think in a most favorable situation, you'd have somebody do a small increase over maintenance, a small surplus, like 100 to 300 calories. And you would confirm that a person's in a small surplus by their scale weight gradually moving up. Pretty modest amount, a few pounds a month, perhaps. Unfortunately, we can't use DEXA, which would be arguably the most accessible and highest fidelity sort of test of body composition and changes in body compartments that people have access to, because nobody's getting an MRI or CT for this. It's just too noisy is the problem. I would have people, while they're doing this, still assume a health-promoting dietary pattern, meaning they're getting enough protein, which we think is somewhere between like 1.4 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. a little bit higher for some folks, but again, that's mostly on the margins. They're still consuming a lot of fiber per day, 30 to 40 grams per day, sort of minimum. And they're still kind of watching their saturated fat intake, particularly from red meat and butter, things like that, keeping those to 10% or less of the dietary pattern. We need to solve for adherence here, because if the goal in exercise prescription is to maximize training load, the goal in dietary prescription is adherence. And this isn't like one day a week, right? Just like one training session is not going to determine your outcomes. One day of eating well is not going to determine your outcome. And just 1 week is not that either. It's months and months stacked on top of each other. And so I actually think, or maybe speculating here, of course, that poor adherence over multiple weeks and maybe like obesity resistant sort of genotypes has what's led to like the existence of the dirty bulk advice. Like, no, you got to have pizza, put olive oil on top of it, and then wash it down with the, sheet cake or something like that. And it's like, all you're doing is solving for the other days of the week under eating, perhaps with a genetic setup that ultimately is resisting weight gain. Those people may need more aggressive sort of, calorie surpluses or more monitoring, but I still don't think a dirty bulk is really the answer there for most folks. Last part of the practical stuff, it has to do with a planned timeline. A lot of people, particularly in this guy's example, 180 to 200 back to 180, it's like, how long did that take? Because legitimately gaining 20 pounds, that's like a year endeavor, right? And I would expect if somebody took that long to do it, that a significant proportion of that would be muscle mass, actual contractile muscle tissue. If you did that at 3 months, I suspect less, right? And so, yeah, that yo-yo thing, you see that all the time show up practically. I'd also have like a waist cap, something like that, or like, oh, your blood pressure is going up, your sleep apnea is getting worse, something like that. If that's going up, it's probably not worth the risk, but also ensure that people are training, which I think everyone listening to this knows that we would recommend that. And then you would individualize your approach based on the response, whether or not you want a slower or faster rate, how long you're going to do this for, and the actual training that you do. It's all based on preferences and your response. Anything you want to add to this sort of bulk cut analysis?
Not a ton. I'm generally not a fan of dedicated periods like this myself. I prefer just kind of more incremental sort of things, kind of like how I design like training programs tends to be more incrementalist in nature rather than like very discrete, very divergent sort of blocks from one phase to the next. The exception would be somebody who's a multi-sport athlete. So, I've worked with folks who like during part of the year, they like to train up and compete, maybe do a powerlifting meet. And then the other end of the year, they like to train more in the endurance realm and run a 10K or a half or a full marathon or something like that. I've had some clients who like to do that over the years. And so that sort of alternating ends up being less of like a deliberate bulk and cut, but more of like, you're just kind of like eating based on the demands of your sport. And then the training almost takes care of the rest. So they naturally will tend to lose weight when they shift their dietary pattern and they're like running, 50, 60 plus, 100-mile weeks or something like that. And then when they cut all that back, doing just like a minimum, and then they're focused more on powerlifting and eating to fuel that, then the weight gain and muscle mass will tend to come back a little bit. So it's almost more like accidental rather than very deliberate. But short of that, again, not being a bodybuilding coach, I don't tend to, subscribe to that idea or put it into practice very much myself.
Yeah. I just think generally speaking, trying to increase muscle mass, if that is your primary goal, straight up maintenance, meaning that your body weight doesn't go up at all.
Unlikely to get you there. Yeah.
Difficult. This podcast is brought to you by Factor. Eating well isn't a willpower problem for me, and it's probably not for you either. It's a setup problem. There's something healthy in the fridge that I should be making, and then it's 8 p.m. I've been at the track all weekend, or the workout went too long, and then the gap between should cook and will cook is roughly the size of the Grand Canyon. So if left to my own devices, I'll order something for delivery and feel great about it for approximately 11 minutes. That's the gap that Factor closes. Fully prepared meals designed by dietitians, made by chefs, delivered to your door, and they're ready in 2 minutes. No planning, no grocery run, no cooking. They've got meals built around whatever you're after, whether it's weight loss, more protein, overall healthy nutrition, GLP-1 support, and a Muscle Pro collection if you're training hard and you care about recovery. The food's fresh, never frozen, with over 100 meals rotated weekly, so you're not eating the same chicken and rice until you hate it. Lean proteins, whole foods, only the stuff you want, and it's pretty good too. Head over to factormeals.com/BBM50off and use code BBM50off to get 50% off and a free daily greens box. If that's something you're into, that's with new subscription only, while supplies last until September 27th, 2026. See the website for more details. Every few episodes, someone asks if eating more protein is going to wreck their kidneys. Now, for most people, the data on that is very reassuring, but lead in your drinking water is a different conversation. The EPA and CDC agree there is no known safe level of lead exposure. The EPA's health-based goal for lead in drinking water is 0, and we're nowhere close to that. The problem is that there are millions of lead service lines still in the ground across the country. So the pipes, the solder, and the plumbing between the treatment plant and your faucet break down over time, and that's how lead gets into the tap water. There's a federal mandate to replace them, but it's on a 10-year timeline, and most of that work hasn't started yet. In adults, chronic low-level lead exposure has been linked to all sorts of things like kidney damage, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. And these are claims from the WHO and CDC's position. And the thing is, you'd never know from looking at your water or tasting it. So that's why I've started filtering my water with Cove Pure. It's a countertop reverse osmosis system. There's no plumber, no installation needed. You plug it in, it sits on your counter. And reverse osmosis is one of the most effective filtration methods for removing lead, PFAS, arsenic, and nitrates. So first thing in the morning when I'm filling up my kettle to make coffee, I use Cove Pure. It's got a touch screen where you pick the temperature you want, hot, cold, or warm, and it dispenses instantly. It also has preset cup sizes, so you can keep track of how much you're taking in. For America's 250th birthday, Cove Pure is giving you $250 off at covepure.com/BBM. That's COVEPURE.com/BBM. Let's talk about the Cold War happening in your bed. No, not that. I'm talking about the temperature. One of you is a furnace, and the other one's got cold feet like 2 blocks of ice. And somewhere around 2 a.m., somebody's stealing the covers and someone's throwing them off. Nobody's sleeping. Everyone's mad. The ChiliPad 2.0 actually solves this. It's a water-based mattress topper that controls your sleep temperature anywhere from 55 to 115 degrees, and the dual zones are the whole point. You run your side cold, your partner runs theirs warm, and the thermostat negotiations are over. It works with the mattress you already own, so you're not buying a whole new bed. And the new nightstand remote is pretty clever. Each side gets its own thermostat, and it's got sensors that notice when you actually get into bed and start your schedule for you. So it works even if you're the type who means well but forgets. There's no subscription, you buy it, you own it, it's got a 2-year warranty, it's designed and assembled in the USA just north of Charlotte, and a cooler bed is one of the better supported ways to fall asleep faster, and honestly, I just stopped waking up annoyed and a little sweaty. Visit www.sleep, that's sleep.me/BBM to get up to $255 off your ChiliPad 2.0 with code BBM. Again, that's www.sleep.me/BBM. This is available for Barbell Medicine podcast listeners for a limited time. Order today and get free shipping and a 30-day sleep trial. The best thing about summer in San Diego is how little I have to think about getting dressed. No coat, no layers, no checking the weather because the weather is the same heroic 72 degrees. It always is. I basically own 2 seasons of clothing and use one of them, which is how I ended up living in Quince. They make well-built essentials, the kind of pieces that quietly become the only things you actually wear. Their 100% European linen pants and shirts are breathable, easy to throw on, and they start at just $34. The t-shirts are soft enough to wear all day, and the lightweight cotton sweaters are what you want when a summer night finally cools off. And everything's priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands because they work directly with ethical factories and they cut out the middlemen. So you're paying for the quality and not somebody's logo or marketing campaign. And it's not just clothing anymore. Quince has turned into my go-to since I moved into a new home, and they've got travel stuff as well. I use this, and you should too. Make your summer wardrobe easier. Go to quince.com/BBM for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/BBM for free shipping and 365-day returns. Something we hear a lot from people who run our programs is that they finish one and then they immediately want to start the next one, or that their goals or preferences shifted partway and they want to switch to something different, which is actually how training should work. It should adapt to you as things change. Now, the problem is buying programs one at a time. Every time that happens, well, that can be hard on the wallet. So we built Barbell Medicine Premium. One subscription and you get the entire program library in our app, all the strength, hypertrophy, conditioning, rehab, general fitness, beginner programs, and everything in between. You can switch whenever you want. And as new programs get added, you get them in the subscription. No per program fees ever. Austin and I build and maintain every program and podcast in both libraries. Same people, the same standards as everything else we put out, now all in one place. It's $19.95 a month, $199 for the year. You can cancel anytime. And if you already subscribe to Barbell Medicine Plus or the programming library separately, you can upgrade and we'll sort it out so that you're not paying twice. Link is in the description below. Check it out now. All right, this next question is about training when you're extremely short on time. So the question is, if someone is extremely short on time, training just once a week for less than an hour and their goal is health and overall well-being, what is better? Focusing on 2 to 3 heavy compound exercises or doing a larger variety of technically easier movements to give the body more movement diversity? So just to make sure I understand the question, if it's 2 to 3 heavy compound lifts, so multi-joint exercises like the squat, bench press, deadlift, right? And what's the comparator? Because it says technically easier, and I don't know that those exercises are super technically demanding. I mean, you could make the argument that a machine-based type training plan would be less skill dependent, right? Because you're not freestanding. There's no real balance component there. But I don't know that that necessitates a greater or smaller amount of exercise variation, right? It's certainly not going to be like dumbbells, right? Because I think like a dumbbell split squat or Bulgarian split squat with dumbbells may actually be like more technically demanding. I also think it's important to point out that because the exercise variety is not likely to be different, it's just a variable that you can, go up or down. I don't think that that's really an important part of the calculus here, the decision making when it comes to exercise prescription. Generally speaking, when I think about exercise selection, I'm thinking it's mostly personal preference, right? Like what does the person want to do and what do they have access to? And then the trainability, it's a made up word that I use to refer to, can a person do the exercise with minimal discomfort and pain? Is their technique acceptable? So it's repeatable, it's fairly efficient, it meets the points of performance. Can they load it, throughout a relatively wide range of different intensities? And then, is it something that they can do a lot of without getting too fatigued? So, for example, somebody may want to train the overhead squat, but their technique isn't there yet. They have some pain when doing it. They don't really have access to a lot of different intensities they can use because of these things, for example. And then it causes a lot of fatigue because they're not really able to do the exercise that well. Doesn't mean they should never do the overhead squat or train that movement pattern, but does it deserve a full slot in their exercise program, especially when the time is limited, like a regular back squat or a leg press even, right? Like in that case, if somebody can't really train the overhead squat, they're mostly just doing, practicing the movement compared to the leg press where they can load it, relatively heavy, a lot of different rep ranges, no pain. They can do a lot of that without generating too much fatigue. When you think about, health benefits from resistance training, that's clearly going to be the winner there. So to start this out, I don't know what the comparator would be between like 2 to 3 heavy compounds that are presumably barbell based versus other multi-joint exercises that are not barbell based, right? If that's the comparator and we're just talking about health, they're the same, right? And if we're talking about performance, like strength, well, then it matters how we're measuring strength, right? So for example, you could have somebody do like Smith machine squats or a leg press and compare it to, that person's evil twin just doing only barbell back squats, right? And then you test their leg extension strength, in 3 months. I would not predict there to be any differences provided they did similar amounts of training load, which is the real goal here, right? The goal with exercise prescription, when you're making a plan for somebody, making a program for them or yourself, is to maximize training load, where training load is not only the amount of exercise that you're doing, but also the nature of it, right? So you think about like 5 sets of 5 on the squat versus 5 sets of 5 on leg extensions. The volume is the same, but the nature of the exercises are different. So you're going to get differential effects, including the fatigue costs of each one. So why would we want to maximize training load, you might ask? Well, we think there's a dose-response relationship between training load and both health and fitness outcomes or performance outcomes. And really, you could just say training adaptations, right? Just lump all of that together. The more training that somebody can do, specifically training loads, it's not just volume, the better or the more adaptations that they're likely to get. And there are 2 big bottlenecks here. One is time, in this case, once a week for less than an hour. And the second bottleneck here, or generally speaking, is the physiological tolerance. So not just can a person perform the exercises listed on paper, but can they recover from it, right? And so as you go along your training career, things are going to change. You're going to have different logistical constraints, time and training resources. So that'll be a constraint on training load and your physiological tolerance, your recovery capacity will also change. Sometimes better as fitness goes up, sometimes less as fitness goes down. These things are all dynamic. So the other thing I want to say about training load is that, I'm less concerned about the training load in one specific session as I am concerned with training load over a longer time scale. So it's not just one workout, not just a week of workouts, and not just like a month of workouts, but like 6 months of workouts. I want to know how much training load did the person do, and I want to maximize that. So as a practical example, let's say you had somebody who had a 4-day-a-week program, and one week they did 3 days a week, and the next week they did 5 sessions in a week, right? So the training load is just it's the exact same as it would otherwise if they did 4 days on week 1 and 4 days on week 2. To me, that all washes out, over a long enough time period. In this particular case, we only have 1 day a week, so we really have to get as much out of that as we can. So within that, and I think maybe more pertinent to this question, exercise selection is another way to sort of distribute and manipulate training load, mainly based around fatigue costs. And we think that fatigue costs are related to how much muscle mass is being used, right? More muscle mass, a little bit more fatigue. How much range of motion is the individual moving through, where a much larger range of motion is likely to cost more fatigue than a much smaller range of motion, where things that are relatively closely related, like a squat to 1 inch below parallel to a squat to 3 inches below parallel, that probably washes out, probably not big enough. The absolute loading contributes, so heavier things tend to be a little bit more fatiguing than lighter things. Again, the gap has to be big enough to matter. People always say things like, "Oh, the deadlift is more fatiguing than the squat," but when it's actually tested, not so much. The real big thing there, and this is kind of an aside, is that most people have done way more squat training than they have deadlift training, so they're more tolerant of the squat. That's another aside. We think skill requirements likely affect fatigue, where something like doing a power clean or a snatch or something would be more fatiguing than, like a leg press, just due to the skill differences. Again, the gap has to be big enough to matter. And then things that are a little bit more concrete that the gaps don't have to be so big to matter would have to do with volume, right? More reps, more sets, increases fatigue, and proximity to failure. Closer to failure or all the way to failure, even that momentary failure would generally increase fatigue. So you can select exercises that use more or less muscle mass, more or less range of motion, have substantial differences in absolute loading, skill requirements, things that kind of allow you to do more volume or less volume. And, the proximity to failure, I think it's just an exercise prescription sort of variable that we use. So at this amount of training load, though, 1 session a week, I don't think this is that important. It's more like, what are the exercises the person wants to do? What do they have access to? What will they do? And then just, try to do as much as possible. This is the same analogy, and we'll come back to this in another question, between conditioning intensity, like the intensity of somebody's cardio, right? Where you have people saying, you got to do all the zone 1, zone 2, easy stuff. And while that can be useful as a sort of heuristic or a general rule of thumb, if somebody doesn't have a lot of time to do conditioning, then that is the wrong sort of prescription. So for example, if the current guidelines say, look, you do somewhere between 150 to 300 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity, that would be like steady state type stuff. But the person only has an hour per week. Well, they would be better served by doing higher intensity conditioning work, whether it's discontinuous, so high intensity interval training, or more continuous stuff, but still at a higher intensity. That would be better because of the limited time than doing lower intensity stuff for the same amount of time, right? It only matters when you get to higher volumes, and we'll come back to that. So it should be clear by now that the real issue here is that 1 time a week with 1 hour of training, the training load is going to be very, very limited. That said, you can still get a lot out of a little. Like muscle strengthening activity correlates with roughly a 10 to 17% lower all-cause mortality in data sets, pretty large data sets, where most of that benefit comes from doing like nothing to moving to just doing 30 to 60 minutes a week. You can get a lot out of a little. Are you going to maximize somebody's performance or health benefits in response to resistance training in that little of training load? Probably not, because they're not going to build enough muscle, enough strength, bone mineral density, other sort of effects we see, particularly with respect to metabolic health. Most people will need more training than that. The other big concern here is that I'm assuming, and there's some risks there, that within this 1 hour per week workout, they also have to get all their conditioning in too. And similarly, there's a dose-response relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness, training load, and cardiorespiratory fitness improvements. So like each one metabolic equivalent increase, where a metabolic equivalent is basically a measurement of how much energy is being used during the activity, each one met increase. This is also used to measure somebody's cardiorespiratory fitness, their capacity. So because it correlates to energy, where we're sitting at rest is like a 1 met activity, and like an 8 met activity would be running at a pretty good clip. You're using 8 times as much energy. So if you can increase somebody's cardiorespiratory fitness by 1 met, then that correlates to a 13% lower mortality for each met there. If you can't do any conditioning, it's going to be challenging to increase your cardiorespiratory fitness. Lifting doesn't really do that unless somebody has really, really low cardiorespiratory fitness levels to start. And then, you get a little bump, but then it plateaus very quickly. So we would have to do all of this, some lifting and some conditioning in that hour, and then basically try to do as much as we can within that hour. So what would you do? We're going to try to do as much resistance training volume as we can while preserving some time to do some conditioning. The way I would do this would look a lot like our time crunch template, our 2-day per week time crunch template. And I would just split that over 2 weeks. And I think supersets would be very useful here because we can get more training load in here by doing so. Specifically, if we do what are called alternate peripheral supersets, where you would do something like an overhead press superset with the leg press, right? Because they just don't have a lot of crossover muscles. And so we can preserve training load, right? So not only how many reps and sets the person's doing, but how much weight they're lifting. So the intensity also contributes here. Compare that to doing like bench press and flies, agonist superset. Well, the training load suffers. So I would think that. And so I would basically do our 2-day per week time crunch template and split it up every 2 weeks. So you're kind of doing workout A on week 1, workout B on week 2, workout A on week 3, workout B on week 4. So you basically just have different exercises for all of the major movement patterns: the squat, press, a pull, and a hinge. So it could be like a back squat and a leg press for the squat pattern. It could be for the press. It could be a bench press and an overhead press. Could be machine press and a dumbbell overhead press. Whatever. For the pull, it could be a chest supported row and a pull up, chest supported row, lat pull down, something like that. And then hinge could be like a deadlift and a hip thrust. I'm just making it up. And so, workout A, you'd pick 4 of those, right? 1 squat, 1 press, 1 row, 1 hinge, set them up alternate peripheral. And then the next week, do the other ones also set up with that alternate peripheral sort of superset. And I would do some conditioning afterwards. And because of the time crunch, there's probably going to be higher intensity stuff, high intensity intervals, probably bordering on sprint intensity intervals for this individual. So if the goal is overall health and you only got 1 hour per week, the best use is sort of this hybrid approach. I think most of the exercises should be multi-joint exercises. So they can become compound movements. They should be compound movements, but they don't have to be barbell based. They could be machine based. They could be some blend of the two, either way. And you should do some conditioning at the end. All right, next question. In the progressive loading episode, you explained that the nervous system, muscle, tendons, and bone adapt to strength training on different timelines. Do they atrophy the same way? So if you have a long layoff, do you lose muscle faster than bone density? Does muscle atrophy outpace the weakening of tendons? Yeah, so this all depends on why the person is experiencing detraining, because that answer drives most of this, and more than the specific tissue. So for example, you can detrain because you've had an injury, right? That it plus or minus being immobilized. You could be immobilized for some other reason. Those two things are different. You could, right, like if without having an injury and being in a cast, you could be sick, for example, with a body-wide infection or some sort of severe disease, or you could just be outside of the gym, normally, walking around, living your normal life, just not exercising. So all of these things are different. And I think most of the scary data with respect to like detraining and muscle loss, strength loss, bone loss, tendon remodeling, a little less so that the data is not so great there. comes from what I would call severe detraining environments. Either the person's bedbound, they're immobilized, either in a research study or due to injury, or they have some sort of medical condition that keeps them bedbound. On top of that, they have an illness that is actively detraining them. So let's start with immobilization. This is a pretty fast and dramatic case, especially around the muscle mass. If you put a healthy young person's leg in a full cast, their quadriceps cross-sectional area, the size, can drop by 3.5% in 5 days and roughly 8% by 2 weeks or 14 days. You put somebody's dominant arm in a sling and their grip strength can go down by 20% in just a few days. Pretty dramatic, pretty scary sounding stuff. But we think the mechanism here is because the limb is unable to move, right? It's being immobilized, that it compromises the excitation, contraction, coupling between basically your central nervous system and later into your peripheral nervous system, how that tells the muscle to contract in a coordinated manner. And so that's why you see these relatively dramatic decreases in strength. This is different than just not going to the gym for a little while because you're busy, right? So it's a different scenario. And further to this point, or the last thing I'll say on this point, there is a cross-training phenomenon that if you take somebody who has an immobilized limb and they work out the rest of their body, particularly the opposite side of their body, it does seem to preserve some of the muscular adaptations, strength and size to some effect. That seems to wane longer term, right? We're not talking about immobilizing somebody for 6 months and you can prevent any loss, but certainly for a few weeks, you can see less of that loss. That's case number one. Case number two would be someone's on bed rest with an illness. Can be even more dramatic than just the immobilization, because not only is the person functionally immobilized, they're in bed, but they also have the potential to have an illness that is actively sort of reducing their adaptation, actively decaying their adaptations. So you think about a catabolic illness like sepsis, right? Some body-wide infection that's gotten into the blood that actively increases muscle protein breakdown. You can see a drop in muscle size, muscle cross-sectional area, 26% in 1 week, which is significant. So you have the unloading that's already happening because you're in bedbound, right? So you are functionally immobilized. But on top of that, you have the condition that's adding on top of that. It's additive. Injury is a little bit different. It's not, people aren't always immobilized and they're generally not completely immobilized, but we see that strength falls pretty dramatically early on, but it doesn't keep getting worse. So basically you see a drop in the first few days, it kind of stabilizes. And then as the person recovers, heals, gets better, it tends to recover relatively quickly. It tends to be proportional to how long the person is unloaded for, right? We're not exercising. And so some of the stuff we talked about in the previous sections apply here. But I think if we're just talking about an otherwise healthy person who's, still, active, maybe not exercising, but just, going about their normal life, the detraining stuff is pretty unimpressive. I mean, top end strength seems to be preserved for at least a couple of weeks. They've got this in powerlifters and Division I strength power athletes and football players off the top of my head. No real meaningful loss of strength or size after a few weeks. Those are highly trained individuals. Over 2 to 3 months, strength loss does occur, usually capped around 10% or so, although this does vary between individuals. And even if it's been years, people are still stronger than their baseline, generally speaking. Again, unless we're talking about immobilization, some sort of illness that is keeping somebody outside of the gym or otherwise from exercising. So it just depends why, right? As a general heuristic, though, strength is lost before size. We see this in sarcopenia too, right? The rate of strength loss is about triple or 3 times as much as that of muscle size loss. But we see this in detraining data too, again, with people who are otherwise healthy or otherwise, doing their normal activities of daily life. They're just not exercising anymore. We see that. We see relatively little data here on tendon adaptation, or we'll call it de-adaptation or decay. There's just not a lot of evidence here. But you would predict that things to go something like this. Strength goes first, size next, tendons later, and then bones way, way later than that. You're not going to see a big drop off there unless something else is going on. Within strength, there is a little nuance here. You think about the different types of strength, stamina, right? How long can you do a submaximal effort repeatedly before getting to failure? We think about maximal low velocity strength, like a 1 rep max squat. And then we think about maximal high velocity strength, so power. Seems like strength stamina falls first. Some of those energy related adaptations, mitochondrial density, capillarization, energy buffering systems, that seems to decay a little bit sooner. So the strength stamina seems to go down first, then maximal low velocity strength, so 1RM stuff. And then later still would be the maximal high velocity strength, the power loss, which is why it is assumed, at least by some, that the loss of power, that's why it tends to be more predictive of sort of poor health trajectories, because you're further along down the pike there. Now, after some detraining has occurred, for whatever reason, many of you, myself included, have experienced a relatively quick sort of return, this muscle memory effect. The question is, why does that happen? And is it even like something real, or are we just all making it up? Well, it has been documented, but as far as why it happens, there are a number of theories here. None of them are perfect. So I'll just, instead of burying the lead or whatever, I'll just say, look, I think it's some combination of all of these things. But the first theory, the one that's most prominent, has the most sort of, let's call it mechanistic data for support, is called the myonuclear domain theory. Now, myonuclei is basically the muscle cell's depot or area that it stores the muscle cell's DNA. It governs or is responsible for the upkeep, remodeling, repair, etc., of an area of muscular protein. And so we call this the myonuclear domain. Its domain is the protein it has control over. Now, when a person detrains, the myonuclei activity goes down, right? And so as a result, the protein in its domain, the muscle protein in its domain, also goes down. But the myonuclei is, for most, all intents and purposes, retained. Not all of them. Some of them go away, but many of them remain. It's just the area gets smaller because the body's not asking it to do anything. And then when you start retraining, the myonuclei are sent a signal to, hey, wake up, man, we got stuff to do. And then the muscle grows and strength is recovered as well. So that's size and strength. That's one theory here. There's some data to support this. Other data is not quite as clean. It's at least one of the major theories as far as why muscle memory occurs. The next one has to do with these sort of lasting neural adaptations. So coordination, movement efficiency, et cetera, that allow the sort of rapid restoration in strength specifically, less to do with muscle size. And so, again, there's less data on this, but that's a thought that, look, if you've done an exercise before, you've accumulated some sort of neural adaptations, coordination-related adaptations for how to do the exercise efficiently, that those are kind of stored somewhere, kind of like a software system, and you get to kind of pull it from your memory bank when you are re-exposed to the activity. Now, another theory actually has to do with sort of an epigenetic theory, which basically describes how the environment and your behaviors, et cetera, produce these sort of long-lasting changes at the level of the DNA, and subsequently how that DNA is expressed and basically tells your cells and body and various tissues like what to do. So the idea is if you previously had trained a lot, you've basically changed your DNA to some level. And so, yeah, when you remove that sort of training signal, the DNA is like, well, what am I supposed to do now? But then when it returns, it's like, oh yeah, I remember what to do. And so that's one of the sort of methods by which muscle memory occurs. Now, the interesting thing here is there's a thought that there's also some negative potential changes that can happen at the level of the DNA due to various disease processes. It's been most well studied in cancer. When I say well studied, that's doing a lot of heavy lifting there, pun intended. But the thought would be that sort of these negative histories that could potentially affect the DNA may also like attenuate, reduce, or otherwise compromise future adaptations. I don't know, man. There's a lot to this. It's just not cleanly explained by one of these theories. So I suspect that all of them to some degree are involved, and you can watch this space. But overall, the rate of decay really depends on the cause. If it is an immobilization that's like, pretty severe, we'll give that like a pretty strong sort of signal for detraining, reductions in muscle size, strength going first, then size, then tendons, then bone. If you paired on top of that unloading due to the immobilization with some sort of systemic illness that on top of that causes additional detraining, well, it's the same sort of ordering, but just more dramatic because you got two things, right? A little double hit type thing going on there. On the other hand, if it's more just like, haven't been in the gym for a while, it's going to take longer for any of those adaptations to occur, but it's still, generally speaking, strength, size, tendons, and then bones. Now, with strength, you can't really decouple the decrease in muscle size and like the neural sort of stuff. So that's just wrapped up in there. Hopefully that answers your question. All right, that's 4 of the questions. Now, in the full episode, we also break down what the enhanced games actually proved about PEDs, the biggest resistance training paper in 17 years, what moves SHBG, that's steroid hormone binding globulin, when you're on testosterone replacement therapy, and what we learned the hard way running our own supplement line, plus a bunch more questions. Speaking of things we sell, the full episode, the archive of past episodes, and a new direct line every month come with Barbell Medicine Plus. And you get discounts on coaching and templates plus our other products while you're there. As of this week, Barbell Medicine Plus is bundled with Barbell Medicine Premium, which adds unlimited access to every training program we've published past, present, and future. Strength, hypertrophy, conditioning, rehab. Switch whenever your goals change. It's $19.95 a month. And yeah, we named one thing Plus and the other thing Premium. We're much better at programming than naming. Now, if these questions were useful, head over and check them out at barbellmedicine.com. Quick public service announcement. We at Barbell Medicine are running our red, white, and blue sale for America's 250th, and I'm required by law to inform you that your path to freedom and independence starts by choosing strength and wellness. Look, that's just the official copy. I'm just here for the 30% off, so let that eagle soar, brother. Here's the deal. Apparel and accessories are 30% off. That's hats, t-shirts, everything we have in stock. It's closeout pricing on the whole selection, so grab your gear before it's gone. Consultations are also 20% off. That's real one-on-one time with our coaches and our physicians. That's myself, Dr. Baraki, and the other Dr. Baraki. We're here to answer your questions and point you in the right direction. Programs are 20% off too. Now, we just released our new 2nd generation Hypertrophy 2 template, but all of our other templates are on sale. 20% off pre-built templates for whatever you're training for. And we also take FSA and HSA. So head to the website and see how your pre-tax dollars can pitch in. The deal ends July 6th at midnight. The discounts are automatic, so you don't need a code at checkout, but you can't combine it with any other offers, and some exclusions may apply. Head over to barbellmedicine.com and go be free.